Okay, so let's look at where we were at. So for electrification, how do we do it? Especially if we're saying, gee, we're not going to use those steady coal-fired plants that go 24/7. We're not going to have the natural gas-fired plants, some of which are able to basically they're big McDonnell Douglas aircraft engines that have a generator in them. That's more or less what the design is, and you can fire those up literally in a few minutes. And to be producing electricity, it's very expensive when you do that. It's about 4 or 5 times the regular base rate, but for peak demand once in a while, those operators, that's what they're there for. And so their cost of fuel is not so important. It's paying for that machine. So, how do you make a reliable grid when you're relying on, say, wind, solar, hydro? How do you do that? And so um, the literature on this and the research on this has been kind of amazing in recent years. We've learned an awful lot about it. And the first thing I want to tackle is just that kind of question. Okay, so let's imagine that we were going to power our city on one solar panel, big array of solar panels, and one wind turbine. Let's say we were in some place where there was a fair amount of wind and some sun. Um, you're thinking right away, my gosh, what happens if it's night and it's not windy? Obviously, at night we don't have any solar power, and if it's not windy at night, we don't have any electricity. That's not going to work. Okay, so wow, I guess we should just quit and go home. All right, have a good evening. No, I'm kidding. Um, so I know a lot of you are thinking, well, but you don't always have that wind generation right there in the same place as the solar. Okay. So let's say that across a state the size of Oregon, you had some of both. Would it be more reliable than if it were just in our hometown? Of course. But still, night comes, right? But what if you had them stretched across 3 or 4 time zones like we have in the continental lower 48 United States? Now you've got a bigger stretching. Now, one of the things to think about is that typically if you just, I'm going to use this thing here. Just imagine a line like this across, which is a 24-hour period, and you have demand that kind of peaks during the day, and then it settles down during the evening and kind of levels out. There's still some demand, of course, at night. Some industries are still operating. People might be heating their houses or air conditioning a little bit. We've got our lights on for a while. But still, usually the lowest demand is at night. So how do you match those up, right? That kind of a problem. So if we had a statewide setup, it would help some. A continental-wide would be very different, wouldn't it? Because not only will we have different times of when it's day and night, we could pass electricity back and forth, the solar piece, but we also have diversified wind arrays. Some places, wind peaks at night. For example, if you go up into Washington State, that whole central Washington wind zone up there, Ellensburg and around, the peak there is 10 p.m. Turns out that a lot of the Texas wind in the interior of Texas is also in the evening. But their solar panels obviously peak during the day, in about the middle of the day. Okay? So when you have a vast, diverse continent, not only going east, west, but north and south, and maybe you think about northern Mexico and that, you can have very different weather patterns during the day. Some places will always be sunny and some won't, okay? Especially when you're going both north and south and east and west, so it's more diversified. Now throw in the idea, gee, not only is it wind and solar, and some places it's windier in the afternoon, like the Oregon coast, in about half the year. And some places it's more of a nocturnal peak or early in the evening. So you combine all that kind of thing together, and then you say, but wait a sec, what about those dams? Remember, those are what we called stocks, right? The stocks of large amounts of potential kinetic energy stored up behind the dam. and you run it through the turbine, and you've got electricity. And you can do that on command to a large degree. So that is a really nice option, because doesn't that fill in those gaps? Yeah. Now, the problem is we now generate more wind than hydro in the United States. So is there enough hydro to balance it out? So this then becomes an increasing challenge. But there are technologies to deal with that, okay? And one of them is what we call pumped hydro. And I'm just clicking here on this so you can see this. And if you just go pumped hydro, if you Google that, you can get the diagram kind of like, there's a whole bunch of them. There's hundreds of them if you do choose image. This is just a kind of classic one. Okay, how does this work? Pumped hydro is not a regular hydroelectric dam per se. It's a special thing. And by the way, this kind of energy storage, and this is what we're talking about, where we store energy up at a higher spot and then run it through when we want. That sounds like a dam. Okay, fair enough. But here's where pumped hydro is different. When you have more electricity than you need, and we can do that already sometimes in the afternoon in the late spring and summer with wind in some parts of the Northwest, okay? We can use some of that excess wind energy, or if you're in California and Arizona, it's solar energy, okay? And we run this in the opposite direction so that it pumps water back up into the reservoir, okay? So that means you're using the electrical energy to pump the water up, increasing its potential kinetic energy, and then when you have another time when there's not enough electricity, then you let it run back through, and it goes the other direction. These were made originally in the southeastern United States. They were really important in the Tennessee Valley Authority projects, where they had several nuclear plants that ran 24/7. And the way that they got rid of the excess energy at night that they didn't need from those base load plants, they couldn't slow them down much, is they pumped the water up and then ran it back through when there was peak demand during the day. That's about 2% of the electricity supply in the United States. This is not mysterious. This is, 60s, 70s era, okay? This is a very mature technology. And now there's proposals in the Pacific Northwest to start doing this more so that we can have a better and more reliable grid if we were to go to a grid that's closer to 100% renewables. I doubt we'll get to 100% renewables anytime real soon. And by then we're going to have a lot more on the way in terms of good ways to store, okay? So what I want to show you then, that makes sense? So let's go back to our slide that we're looking at. And we were here. Okay, so pumped hydro is one kind of storage technology. Another is compressed air. There's some caverns in Louisiana, some places where they've done this, where you literally use that excess electricity to pump air into a large underground chamber that's fairly airtight. And the more air you pump in there, the greater the pressure of the air. And amazingly, it does come back. When you want to release it, the pressure comes out and it runs a propeller or like a generator, and there you get it, okay? By the way, pumped hydro can be pretty efficient in the high 80s and 90%. Compressed air, I don't know the efficiency of that, but I know it's done in several places. And the French, by the way, they call them pneumatic energy storage devices, have been developing these for their electricity supply and their particular industry. Now, another way to save electricity, because it is kind of more like a flow than a stock, how do you save it, right? Is if you have an excess from whatever renewables are out there, wind or solar or wave, whatever it is, then you can make hydrogen with it. And hydrogen, then when you recombine it with oxygen, releases a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy to split the water molecule. And when then you recombine the hydrogen and oxygen together, that same amount of energy is released. Now, there's some inefficiencies in the process. It's not 100% efficient, but that concept is what it is. Fuel cells are how we do that. Those technologies have been around for decades. You do have some losses, though, so it's not perfectly efficient to do that. And it's still kind of expensive. There's been talk about trying to drive that price down through mass manufacturing. I've been hearing that talk for 20 years. Originally, in fact, in California, there was discussion, should we go to electric cars or should we go to hydrogen-powered cars and splitting the water molecule with renewable energy electrons, okay, from wind and solar. Which way do we go? And for a while, they said hydrogen, maybe that's the way. In fact, there is a hydrogen highway in parts of California where there are places you can fill up a special vehicle for that. So the vehicles are expensive because they're not manufactured, and so is the technology. So you have a chicken and egg problem with that. Okay, don't have enough. Nobody's making the vehicles because there's not enough capacity out there to power them. But everybody's saying, well, why are we going to build all this capacity if nobody's going to make the vehicles? So it's a chicken and egg policy problem. But it's also very expensive, and it's not entirely clear whether these would ever be able to compete with more conventional electric vehicles. Now, this is, in a sense, a kind of electric vehicle, but it's not the conventional one where you just have a standard battery. Okay? Now, but that would be one way to store electricity, is to store it in the hydrogen, and then when you need it, you use it as a fuel or you put it back in a fuel cell. Either way, it can be combusted or it can be run through a fuel cell. And basically the waste product is water. Industrial batteries are another. There's a lot of work done on those. And in fact, there are, this kind of famous story, you can Google Elon Musk, Australia, New South Wales, and get a story about how they use a lot of the lithium-ion batteries in an industrial rate down there as energy storage and also smoothing out energy supply in their grid. It's kind of a funny story, really, and really remarkable, too. It's been very profitable for the battery makers. One thought is that you then just have big battery arrays, and when you have that excess energy from the wind farms or the solar or whatever it is nearby, you just put it in those batteries and then you release it, and you do that on a regular basis. The batteries aren't really cheap enough to be cost effective, though, except in kind of when there's real peak prices paid for electricity. So it's a system that has some limitations and costs. And I don't know whether it'll ever be cheap enough to do that on a mass scale, but there is some of that just starting in California. And some of the areas where peak electricity gets real expensive, instead of running it through that gas turbine, they're just storing it in batteries, and they say it's actually beating the gas turbine operators in some places. So it's just starting to happen. As those battery prices go lower, we'll see how that goes. But that's something that either that or there's a bunch of other technologies for industrial batteries that might work out. Now, the next one is distributed EV to grid, is what sometimes they call that. But this basically means if you've got a bunch of electric cars around and they have smart meters on them and they're part of a smart grid, you could put a buy order in your electric car when it's hooked up to the grid and the internet, and it would buy, or its own internet, and it would buy electricity when there's a glut if you're not driving it, if it's hooked up, and then it could even resell it when there's a peak time and it's expensive. Let's say you're at work and you're hooked up to maybe a plug-in at work, it could sell it back. Okay, this has been talked about for a couple decades. We don't really have like an operational plan. But there's no reason that it wouldn't work. We just don't have enough EVs around or a system that's come to rely on them. But it would be a way in mass to store a huge amount of electricity. So something to think about. And one other thing I want to say about electric vehicles is that they are, that the energy cost per mile is one thing that we should look at. So what I will do is I will come to that energy cost per mile question that relates to this a little bit next time we meet, which is going to be when you hear the next video.